So, I've been thinking about Obi-Wan Kenobi a lot lately. That's probably not a surprising thing to hear on a channel like this, but bear with me, because I think there's something genuinely unusual about this particular character that's worth sitting with before we get into the story itself. He's one of those figures who seems simple on the surface and just keeps getting more complicated the longer you look at him. An old man in a cave, essentially. That's what he is when we first meet him, if you watch the films in release order. He's this sun-weathered hermit in the Tatooine desert who appears from nowhere, helps a young farm boy, and then lets himself be killed about 40 minutes later. That's your first impression. And then you start pulling at the thread, and suddenly you're here, watching a 2-hour sleep video about the full arc of his life. I genuinely can't think of another character in Star Wars, or maybe in popular fiction generally, who carries quite so much story in what initially reads as a supporting role. The more Lucasfilm has filled in around him, through the prequel films and the Clone Wars animated series, and the Disney Plus show, and the comics and the novels, the richer it all gets. And the thing is, it holds together. All of it feeds back into who that old man in the cave is, and why he made the choices he made. Tonight we're going through all of it, properly, in order. From the very beginning, which is on a planet most people have never heard of, to the very end, which as it turns out isn't really an end at all in the Star Wars sense. We'll be covering the films obviously, but a lot of the best Obi-Wan material is in the animated Clone Wars series, which ran for 7 seasons and is genuinely worth your time if you haven't seen it. We'll also touch on some of the expanded universe material, the novels and comics and so on, particularly the older Legends material from before Disney rebooted the canon in 2014. That stuff isn't technically official anymore, but it adds texture, and some of it is just good. I'll be clear when we're in Legends territory versus canon. If you're new around here and you like this kind of thing, there's a subscribe button somewhere on screen. No pressure. And now, without further fuss, let's go back to the very beginning, which means going to a planet with a very silly name. The planet is called Stewjon. I need you to understand that this is canon. It appears in official Star Wars reference books. It is the confirmed homeworld of Obi-Wan Kenobi, one of the greatest Jedi who ever lived, a man who shaped the fate of the galaxy across multiple generations. And the planet is called Stewjon. It was named after Jon Stewart, the American late-night television host, as a joke in a 2010 convention panel that accidentally became official law. George Lucas confirmed it on stage, and then it just stuck. So that's where we're starting. Stewjon. Nothing else is known about it, incidentally. We don't have a description of the landscape or the culture, or whether it has any other notable exports besides one extremely significant, Force-sensitive child. It's just a name floating in the corner of the Star Wars universe, waiting patiently to be more. What we do know is that Obi-Wan was born there around 57 BBY, which is the Star Wars calendar system, where BBY stands for before the Battle of Yavin, and ABY is after. The Battle of Yavin is when the first Death Star gets blown up in A New Hope. So everything in Obi-Wan's life, right up until his death on that same Death Star, happens in the BBY era. He was, for the record, around 57 years old when he died, which makes him older than Alec Guinness made him feel, but also younger than you might expect for someone who reads as ancient from the first frame. He was taken to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant when he was 6 months old, as was the way with Force-sensitive children in the era of the Republic. The Jedi would find them young, and with the consent of their parents, bring them in. There's something a little sad about that if you think about it too long. All those infants just taken off to this enormous city-planet temple. But it was also simply how the Order worked, and Obi-Wan himself never seemed to have any bitterness about it. He had a family in the temple, a community. That was his world. There's a note in the Obi-Wan Kenobi Disney Plus series, delivered almost in passing, where Obi-Wan mentions to young Leia that he thinks he might have had a brother. There's a long history to that detail, one that traces back to the 1983 novelization of Return of the Jedi, in which Owen Lars was originally described as Obi-Wan's brother, a fact later retconned by the prequels when Owen was repositioned as Anakin's stepbrother instead. The Disney Plus series acknowledged the old detail without resolving it. Whether Obi-Wan had an actual biological sibling on Stugin who he was taken away from at 6 months old, or whether this was a half memory, a feeling, something he sensed without being able to confirm, is left open. I like that the show included it. It's the kind of detail that makes a character feel like a real person rather than a construct. The fact that there are things about his own history he doesn't know, can't access, can only wonder about. He was a baby when he left Stugin. He doesn't remember it. He has the temple and the Order and Qui-Gon and everything that came after. But somewhere at the beginning, before all of that, there was a family he never got to know. Life as a youngling meant years of training in the Force, learning to meditate, learning basic lightsaber forms, living in what were essentially dormitory groups called clans. It was a structured, communal existence, very much a boarding school atmosphere, which probably goes some way to explaining the particular flavour of dry, slightly beleaguered British politeness that Obi-Wan carries through every incarnation. Some environments just produce that. The interesting thing about Obi-Wan's youngling years, the thing he mentioned to Qui-Gon later, as though it still surprised him, was that he was apparently quite rebellious. He broke rules. He was independent-minded in ways the Masters found challenging. He told Qui-Gon once that the other Masters were probably surprised anyone was willing to take him on as an apprentice, which, given how methodical and careful and almost fussily correct Obi-Wan becomes as an adult, is a genuinely funny detail. Somewhere in there is a scrappy, difficult kid who gave the Jedi Council headaches. Now the system worked like this. Younglings would train together until around age 13, at which point they'd go through a sort of evaluation process where Jedi Knights and Masters, looking for Padawans, could observe them and choose. If you were chosen, you left your clan and began your individual apprenticeship. If you weren't chosen by the time you reached a certain age, you'd be redirected to one of the other Jedi Service Corps. The Agri-Corps, say, which assigned Force sensitives to work on agricultural projects on various planets, or the Med Corps, or the Exploration Corps. Honourable work, useful work, but not the life of a Jedi Knight. Obi-Wan was approaching that cut-off age, and it was looking uncertain. The Jedi Master, who would eventually take him, Qui-Gon Jinn, had reasons to be cautious about taking on another apprentice. His previous Padawan, a young man named Xanatos, had turned to the dark side during a mission on his home planet. That failure sat heavily on Qui-Gon. He'd come to the conclusion that he simply wasn't good at being a teacher, and he wasn't in a hurry to prove himself right again. But then he saw Obi-Wan. It's told slightly differently in different versions, but the broad shape of it is consistent. Qui-Gon observed a sparring match. Something in the young man caught his attention, and by the time they ended up on a mission together to the planet Bandamir, dealing with a criminal organization called Off-World Corporation, Qui-Gon had changed his mind. He saw something worth taking a chance on, and that decision, made reluctantly by a man who'd been burned before, is in some ways the pivot on which all of Star Wars history turns. Everything that follows, the Clone Wars, the fall of Anakin Skywalker, the rise of the Rebel Alliance, Luke and Leia, and the eventual defeat of the Empire, all of it traces back to Qui-Gon Jinn watching a 13-year-old break rules in a sparring match and deciding, fine, I'll give it one more try. There's something I find quietly lovely about that. The great historical forces in Star Wars are always about destiny and the Force and the prophecy of the Chosen One. But underneath all of that often is just one person making a personal choice that they didn't have to make. Qui-Gon choosing Obi-Wan is one of those moments. Obi-Wan was his third Padawan, technically. There had been a successful student before Xanatos, a Jedi named Femor, whose existence was a minor canonical mystery for years before being clarified in a comic. Femor trained well and became a knight, but Qui-Gon's failure with Xanatos had eclipsed everything, and it was Xanatos he thought of when he thought about his record as a teacher. That's a very human way to keep score, incidentally. One painful failure outweighing multiple successes. Obi-Wan, for his part, had no way of knowing any of this when he started. He just knew that someone had finally chosen him. Qui-Gon Jinn is one of those characters who appears in exactly one film and somehow manages to cast a shadow over the entire rest of the saga. He was played by Liam Neeson, which obviously helped, but it's more than that, it's the quality of him. He's the Jedi Master who should have been on the Council but kept refusing to play politics. He believed in what he called the living force, which was a more intuitive, present-tense approach than the careful long-view philosophy the Council favoured. He trusted instinct. He followed where the Force led him, even when the Council would have preferred he follow a meeting agenda instead. He was described by the other Jedi as Maverick, which in Jedi speak is basically the nicest possible way of saying he was a constant headache. Obi-Wan believed Qui-Gon could have been on the Council if he'd just been willing to bend a little. Qui-Gon evidently disagreed about the value of bending. That tension was part of their dynamic from the beginning. What the canon has slowly filled in about their years together before the Phantom Menace is genuinely interesting. The best single example of it, for my money, is the year they spent on Mandalore. This is background that the Clone Wars animated series eventually illuminates, but the broad shape of it is this. When Obi-Wan was a teenager, a civil war broke out on Mandalore. A young Mandalorian noblewoman named Satine Kryze had aligned herself with a pacifist faction called the New Mandalorians, who believed that Mandalore's warrior traditions had caused nothing but suffering and that the planet should put down its weapons. This made her a target for the various warring clans who disagreed strongly with that assessment. The Jedi sent protection. Specifically, they sent Qui-Gon Jinn and his teenage Padawan. For a year, the three of them, Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, and Satine, moved through Mandalore, surviving assassination attempts, navigating the chaos of the Civil War, and apparently having quite a lot of adventures in the process. And somewhere in that year, Obi-Wan fell in love with her. We're told about this obliquely, in pieces, mostly through the Clone Wars series, where an older Obi-Wan and an older Satine encounter each other again, and their history is written all over every scene they share. What we eventually learn is that it was genuine and serious. Obi-Wan said in a conversation I think about more than is probably warranted, that if Satine had asked him to leave the Jedi Order, he would have. He wouldn't have hesitated. He told her that directly. He didn't leave, of course. Satine didn't ask, and Obi-Wan returned to his training, and they went their separate ways, carrying what they carried. But that detail that there was a moment where the whole story could have gone differently, where Obi-Wan Kenobi could have just been a man who fell in love on Mandalore and stayed, is something the writers clearly understood mattered. It makes him more complete as a person. Jedi, who seem to have no inner life, no desires or attachments, tend to feel a bit like furniture. Obi-Wan doesn't. He made a choice, and the choice cost him something. Now, the teaching itself. Their training relationship was not without friction. Qui-Gon had a specific philosophy about how to develop a Padawan that didn't always communicate well. He deliberately kept Obi-Wan practicing basic lightsaber forms for a long time, rather than allowing him to advance to more complex techniques. His reasoning, which he apparently didn't share clearly at the time, was that mastery of the fundamentals was the foundation of a distinct personal style, and he didn't want to rush that. He wanted Obi-Wan to build something solid. What this felt like to Obi-Wan in practice was that his master didn't think he was ready. It dented his confidence. There were periods where their relationship was strained because of it, where Obi-Wan felt held back and Qui-Gon felt misunderstood. The fact that they came out the other side of all that with a deep, warm, genuinely affectionate bond says something good about both of them. By the time the two of them appear at the beginning of The Phantom Menace, they've been together for well over a decade. Obi-Wan is in his late 20s. They banter with the ease of people who know each other very well and have survived a lot together. They disagree about things. Still, you can see that too, but it's the disagreement of colleagues and friends rather than a friction that hasn't resolved. Obi-Wan thinks the council is usually right, and Qui-Gon should follow its guidance more carefully. Qui-Gon thinks the council sometimes substitutes rules for wisdom. Neither of them is entirely wrong about this. There's a warmth in those early scenes of Phantom Menace that I think sometimes gets underappreciated because the film gets so much criticism, generally. The two of them sitting with the Trade Federation delegation before things go wrong, Obi-Wan being quietly exasperated by the situation while Qui-Gon is serenely unconcerned. Their shorthand is obvious. The trust between them is obvious. It matters later that we've seen this. One more thing worth mentioning about Qui-Gon before we move into the events of the Phantom Menace. He had been, for years before anyone else had, investigating the possibility of a Jedi retaining their consciousness after death and communicating from beyond it. The traditional understanding in the Jedi Order was that death was simply the end, that a Jedi returned to the Force and dissolved into it. Qui-Gon believed, based on things he'd encountered or sensed, that it was possible to do something more, to hold on to your individual awareness and speak from wherever the Force led you after life. He'd been trying to work out how. He hadn't managed it yet, and he would run out of time to manage it before he got the chance to teach Obi-Wan properly. But the thread he'd been pulling at would eventually matter enormously. The technique he was reaching toward, that the Jedi had apparently lost and he was trying to recover, would eventually become the gift he passed on from death, which is exactly the kind of poetic reversal that Star Wars, when it's working well, is very good at. He was also, as a side note, trained by Count Dooku, which means that Obi-Wan's teacher's teacher is the saga's secondary villain. The Jedi lineage in this story has a complicated relationship with the dark side, to put it gently. Dooku to Qui-Gon, to Obi-Wan, to Anakin, each of them at some point brushing against something their predecessor feared. It's the kind of thing you notice the more you look at the whole shape of it. Now, there's something interesting about what Qui-Gon's teaching method, frustrating as it was in the moment, actually produced. Obi-Wan emerged from that training with a mastery of lightsaber form 3, known as Sorasu, that was considered exceptional even among the Jedi. Sorasu was a defensive form, developed specifically in response to the increasing prevalence of blaster weapons in the galaxy. It was about deflecting, redirecting, minimizing your own exposure while waiting for your opponent to overextend. It was also, in the hands of a master, nearly impenetrable. What Sorasu required was patience. You couldn't fight in this style if you were impulsive or reactive. You had to be able to sustain focus under sustained attack without moving into aggression, which is a particular kind of discipline that not everyone can maintain. The irony of Qui-Gon holding Obi-Wan to basics for all those years is that the basics he kept practicing were exactly the foundations of the most patient form. His teaching method accidentally produced the ideal practitioner of the ideal form for someone with Obi-Wan's temperament. Anakin, by contrast, trained in Form Phi, Gem So, which was aggressive and powerful and relied on overwhelming your opponent. Watching them spar in the Clone Wars series, when the series illustrates it, is a study in contrasting philosophies. Obi-Wan reading and deflecting and looking for the opening. Anakin creating his own openings through Force. Two people who complemented each other in a way that made them very effective together, and who were deeply mismatched when they eventually had to fight each other. The lightsaber was the most visible aspect of Obi-Wan's training, but not the only one that mattered. Qui-Gon also taught him patience in the larger sense, the ability to wait for the right moment without forcing it, to trust the Force's timing, to resist the impulse to act when acting wasn't required. This would serve Obi-Wan in ways he couldn't have anticipated, in the years when the only thing he could do was wait, and waiting had to be enough. The Phantom Menace came out in 1999 and was, to put it diplomatically, not received the way George Lucas had hoped. People had waited 16 years for a new Star Wars film. What they got was a movie that spent a great deal of time on trade dispute politics, introduced a CGI character whose comedy relief was not to everyone's taste, and gave its villain almost no dialogue. The critical response at the time was mixed. The cultural response was, eventually, more complicated than that. And now, there's a generation of people who grew up with it as their first Star Wars film and are entirely prepared to defend it. I find myself somewhere in the middle. There are things in The Phantom Menace that are genuinely excellent, and one of them is the specific portrait it gives us of Obi-Wan at this particular moment in his life. Capable, disciplined, clearly good at his job, and still very much in the position of the younger partner, deferring to a master he has a great deal of affection for. The film opens with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon being sent to negotiate with the Trade Federation, which has blockaded the planet Naboo in retaliation for Senate taxation of trade routes. This is the kind of political backdrop that caused a certain percentage of audiences to check their watches. But the Jedi don't particularly care about the taxation question. They're there to mediate before things escalate. Things escalate anyway. The Trade Federation, under the influence of Darth Sidious, a shadowy Sith Lord operating through them, tries to assassinate the two Jedi before the negotiations even begin. They escape to Naboo, rescue the planet's queen, Padme Amidala, and get out. Their ship is damaged in the escape, and they have to divert to Tatooine for repairs, which is, of course, where everything changes. Tatooine. Obi-Wan stays on the ship, while Qui-Gon goes into the market town of Mos Espa with a small group including the Queen's handmaidens. In a junk dealer's stall, Qui-Gon meets a 9-year-old boy named Anakin Skywalker, who is enslaved along with his mother. Qui-Gon takes a blood sample, sends it to Obi-Wan on the ship for analysis, and Obi-Wan's reading of the results comes back with a midi-chlorian count, higher than any Jedi on record. Higher than Yoda. Midi-chlorians are the in-universe biological marker for force sensitivity, and they're one of the things people complained about most in The Phantom Menace, the argument being that making the force measurable and biological stripped it of its mysticism. I understand that criticism. I also think Qui-Gon's response to the number, which is essentially a quiet, deeply moved sense of recognition, communicates something about faith that doesn't actually depend on the biological mechanism. He believed this boy mattered before the number confirmed it. The number just told him why. Obi-Wan was skeptical. He said as much. He told Qui-Gon, on their way back to the ship, that he had a bad feeling about this, which is a line every Star Wars character says at least once, but in this case, it was genuinely prescient. Obi-Wan's unease about Anakin Skywalker would not resolve for a very long time. They bring Anakin to the Jedi Council on Coruscant. Qui-Gon presents him as a candidate for training. The Council, including Yoda and Mace Windu, declines. He's too old, they say. He's full of fear. Fear leads to anger, leads to suffering, and so on. Qui-Gon argues. The Council stands firm. This is one of those moments where Qui-Gon's relationship with the Council's authority is on full display. He clearly thinks they're wrong. He makes sure they know he thinks they're wrong. And then they move on to the crisis at hand, because Naboo is still occupied. The final battle on Naboo is where the film spends most of its dramatic energy, and for good reason. The Duel of the Fates, the three-way fight between Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, and Darth Maul in the Theed power generator, is still one of the best choreographed lightsaber sequences in the entire saga. The music helps enormously. There's a reason John Williams won awards for this score, but the choreography is extraordinary on its own terms. The three of them moving through the corridors with a physicality that the original trilogy's duels, wonderful as they were, never quite had. And then the energy gates close. The fight is broken into segments by the red laser barriers cycling open and shut, and Qui-Gon and Darth Maul end up on one side while Obi-Wan waits behind a barrier, unable to reach his master. He watches. The gates cycle. They're not open long enough. He watches Maul drive his lightsaber through Qui-Gon's chest. I don't think that moment gets worse no matter how many times you've seen it. Partly, it's the music, which shifts into something quieter and more anguished. But mostly, It's Ewan McGregor's face. The grief comes off him immediately, and underneath it there's something else, something that looks like fear, not for himself, but for what this means. He's just watched his master die, and the gates are still closed, and he has to wait. When they open, the fight is short. Obi-Wan and Maul. Obi-Wan loses his lightsaber, goes down a shaft, catches himself. Maul above him, confident. Obi-Wan pushing off the wall, somersaulting up, calling Qui-Gon's lightsaber to his hand, cutting Maul in half. It happens in seconds. It's exactly the kind of desperate, instinctive action that Qui-Gon's training, for all its frustrations, had prepared him for. And then he's kneeling with his master's head in his hands, and Qui-Gon is asking him to train the boy, to promise. And Obi-Wan, 25 years old, the most grief-stricken he's ever been in his life, says yes. The council agrees reluctantly, because it was the dying wish of a man they respected. Obi-Wan is knighted, Anakin Skywalker becomes his Padawan, and the sequence of events that will eventually burn half the galaxy and leave Obi-Wan living in a cave is set in motion. There is a quiet detail at Qui-Gon's funeral that I keep coming back to. Yoda and Mace Windu are watching the pyre, and Yoda says something has returned. The Sith. A master and apprentice. Mace wonders which one was destroyed at Theed, the master or the apprentice. Yoda says always two there are, no more no less. They don't know about Darth Sidious yet. They don't know that Maul was the apprentice, that the master is standing about 40 feet away in the crowd, attending a funeral for a man he had killed, as the Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic. That's quite a film when you lay it out like that. One more detail worth sitting with about the aftermath of Naboo, which doesn't get discussed as much as it should. After the Jedi Council agreed to let Obi-Wan train Anakin, there was a funeral for Qui-Gon, a proper Jedi pyre in the city of Theed, with the Council present, and Padme Amidala, and Chancellor Palpatine, and all the visiting dignitaries. Obi-Wan was 25 years old, freshly knighted, standing at his master's funeral 3 days after watching him die, having just been given responsibility for a 9-year-old boy he'd barely met. He had no period of mourning in any conventional sense. There was no time for it, and the Jedi Code didn't particularly encourage the kind of extended personal grief that might have been useful. He was expected to pick himself up and move forward with his new charge. And by all accounts, that's what he did. But the grief didn't go away. It rarely does when it's dealt with by suppression rather than processing. And the Clone Wars series shows us, in various small ways, how much Qui-Gon's loss continued to mean to him. The way he still references things Qui-Gon taught him. The way the Mortis vision of his master clearly moves him despite his attempts to be analytical about it. The decade he spends trying to reach him through the Force and failing. You could argue that one of the foundational problems of Obi-Wan's relationship with Anakin was that he came to it still grieving and never quite resolved that grief before it was buried under the demands of the job. He was teaching a boy he had misgivings about. In honor of a promise made to a man he was still mourning, trying to be a father figure when he himself had just lost the closest thing to a father he'd had. There are worse explanations for why that relationship developed the particular tensions it did. Naboo itself, the planet, is worth one small aside. It's where Qui-Gon was cremated. It's where Padme Amidala would eventually be buried. It's the planet where Anakin and Padme secretly married, and where in some sense the chain of events that ended the Republic began. Tatooine gets most of the symbolic weight in the saga, the planet of origin and return. But Naboo is where several of the story's most consequential things happened, and where several of its most significant people are at rest. Obi-Wan probably didn't go back. There wasn't really a reason to. Here is something I find worth dwelling on. Obi-Wan Kenobi agreed to train Anakin Skywalker at his most vulnerable moment, because his dying master asked him to, and then spent years wondering if he was the right person for the job. He said as much, years later, in the way that characters in Star Wars sometimes say things in one context that quietly illuminates something much bigger in retrospect. He reflected that Anakin had got a raw deal, being assigned to a teacher who had barely passed his own trials, who was still grieving, who had misgivings he never fully put aside. He did the best he could with what he had. The question of whether that was enough haunts the entire middle section of this story. What we know about those early years, the decade between The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, comes mostly from comics and the novel Master and Apprentice, plus whatever we can infer from how Obi-Wan and Anakin present in Episode 2. And what's striking is how different they were from the beginning. Obi-Wan, trained by a maverick but fundamentally respectful of structure and discipline. Anakin, born outside the system, enslaved on a desert planet until he was 9, and then suddenly told that he was special in a way that no one had ever been special before. The chosen one, the one who would bring balance to the Force. That's a lot to carry. That's an enormous thing to tell a child. The relationship between them deepened over those years into something genuinely brotherly, which is a word Obi-Wan himself uses in Revenge of the Sith. He called Anakin his brother, and brothers have complicated dynamics, the older one teaching, the younger one sometimes resenting the teaching, both of them occasionally needing the other to be wrong so they could feel right. There was love there, clearly, and underneath the love, there was always that unspoken thing. Obi-Wan's worry that Anakin's gifts were running ahead of his judgment, and Anakin's frustration that Obi-Wan seemed to be holding him back. Obi-Wan was elevated to Jedi Master at some point during this period, almost certainly after Anakin's training was considered complete enough that he'd been made a knight. That promotion meant a seat on the Jedi High Council, which was a significant thing. He was one of the younger council members in that era, and he took the responsibility seriously. Now, talking about their early training brings up something worth spending a moment on, which is what being a Jedi Master actually meant during the Late Republic. The Council was the governing body of the Order, but it was also an advisory body to the Senate and the Republic more broadly. Jedi served as diplomats, as peacekeepers, as mediators in conflicts too complicated or dangerous for ordinary negotiators. They were sent into the galaxy's troubled corners. They were the first call for crises that the Senate didn't know how to handle through normal channels. Obi-Wan was excellent at this. He was a natural diplomat in a way that Qui-Gon, for all his wisdom, wasn't quite. Qui-Gon was too much himself, too willing to act unilaterally. Obi-Wan understood the value of working within the structure, of persuading rather than simply deciding. He had a quality that's difficult to name precisely, a kind of patient authority that made people trust him. He could walk into a room on a planet he'd never visited, among people with no particular reason to listen to him, and within 20 minutes, they'd be asking his opinion on things. He was also, it must be said, good in a fight in a way that sometimes surprises people who remember him primarily as the philosophical, measured elder of the original trilogy. The Obi-Wan of the prequel era is a formidable combatant. His lightsaber form, Sora-Su, was a primarily defensive style, designed to read and redirect attacks rather than to overwhelm through aggression. It was considered the most perfect defensive form in the Order. What it meant in practice was that Obi-Wan could fight for a very long time without ever quite giving his opponent what they were looking for. He'd wait, he'd deflect, he'd let the other person tire or make a mistake. There was something almost philosophical about his combat style, a patience to it that matched his character in interesting ways. Anakin's style was the opposite, pure aggression, power and speed. They trained together constantly during those years, and their styles in sparring apparently complemented each other well, each of them learning to read the other completely, which is part of why their eventual fight on Mustafar is so devastating to watch. One small detail about those years that I've always found touching. When Obi-Wan was first assigned to care for Anakin, he apparently had genuine misgivings, not about Anakin as a person, but about his own readiness to be a teacher. He was 25, new to his knighthood, still processing his master's death. He wrote at some point that Anakin deserved someone better prepared, and then he set those feelings aside and got on with it, because that was what was needed. That's very Obi-Wan. The private doubt and then the public steadiness. The world outside their training was changing, meanwhile, in ways that would soon make the question of Anakin's readiness less theoretical. The Republic was cracking. Separatist movements were gathering. The old political certainties were shifting. And then there was an assassination attempt on a senator, and everything began to accelerate. Something worth noting about those years in the context of Obi-Wan's broader story. This was a period when he seemed, by most available evidence, genuinely content. Not without complexity, and not without the ongoing worry about Anakin's trajectory, but fundamentally engaged with his life, in a way that the years before and after didn't quite match. He was on the council. He was respected. He had friends, or at least colleagues he trusted. The Republic was imperfect but functioning. The dark side felt manageable. He had his brother beside him. It's easy looking backward from the catastrophe to read the whole prequel era as nothing but a long decline into disaster. But for Obi-Wan, that decade between Naboo and the outbreak of the Clone Wars was probably the closest thing to a settled, good life he experienced. He was doing what he was trained to do, with someone he loved, in a world that still mostly made sense. He didn't know it was ending. Nobody does. 10 years after The Phantom Menace and Anakin Skywalker is 20, with all the turbulence that implies. Attack of the Clones opens with an assassination attempt on Senator Padme Amidala, the same person who was Queen of Naboo in the previous film and is now representing her planet in the Galactic Senate. She's one of the leading voices opposing the creation of a military army for the Republic, which is an urgent political question because of the growing separatist movement. Someone wants her quiet enough about it to hire an assassin. The Jedi Council assigns Obi-Wan and Anakin to protect her while the threat is investigated. What happens next splits the two of them in the way that shapes the rest of the film. Anakin goes with Padme to Naboo, where she can be protected in relative isolation. Obi-Wan follows the only lead available, which is a dart used in the assassination attempt. And this is where the film becomes, for a stretch, something that almost plays like a detective story, which I appreciate quite a bit. The dart is identified as coming from a planet called Kamino, but the planet doesn't appear in the Jedi Archive star charts. It seems to simply not exist. Obi-Wan goes to the archive librarian, who tells him confidently that if the planet isn't in the archive, it doesn't exist. Yoda, when Obi-Wan brings this to him while using it as a teaching moment with a group of younglings, gently suggests an alternative explanation. Someone may have erased it. A planet doesn't cease to exist because it's missing from a catalogue. Obi-Wan goes to the coordinates implied by surrounding star systems and finds Kamino exactly where it should be. An ocean world of endless storms, and elegant, elongated inhabitants called Kaminoans, who open their doors to him and treat him as an expected guest. Because apparently, a Jedi Master named Sifo Dyas commissioned a clone army from them 10 years ago, and they assumed this arriving Jedi was here to inspect it. The clone army has been in production this whole time, paid for by someone, raised in enormous facilities on this storm-lashed planet, all of them grown from a single template. That template is a bounty hunter named Jango Fett, who is living on Kamino with his young son Boba, a clone he requested for himself, unaltered and unmodified. Obi-Wan interviews Jango with the particular brand of seemingly casual conversation that is actually very careful information gathering. He learns very little directly, but he notices enough. Jango and Boba flee shortly after, which tells Obi-Wan all he needs to know about how innocent Jango's involvement actually is. The subsequent chase is one of the more fun action sequences in Episode 2. Obi-Wan and Jango's ship engaged in a space battle through an asteroid field, Jango using every trick available, including a sonic mine that I think is genuinely terrifying as a concept. Obi-Wan manages to stay with him all the way to Geonosis, an arid industrial planet where he finds the separatist leadership gathered, and Count Dooku at the centre of it. Dooku, Qui-Gon's former master. A Jedi who left the Order voluntarily, which was unusual enough to be notable, and who had apparently been cultivating this separatist movement for years. He presents himself as an idealist, a man disillusioned with the corruption of the Republic, who simply wanted something different. The truth is a great deal darker, but Obi-Wan doesn't have access to the full truth yet. He sends a message to Coruscant before he's captured, and then he's in a detention cell. The arena battle at Geonosis, where Obi-Wan and Anakin and Padme end up fighting for their lives against enormous creatures in a gladiatorial pit, is the spectacular set piece the film has been building toward. It's also where the clone army arrives, where Yoda appears with an entire military force, and where the Clone Wars formally begin. Obi-Wan's fight with Count Dooku goes badly, both of his arms wounded before Anakin tries to help, and things go worse. Yoda saves them, and then fights Dooku himself, and Dooku escapes. Count Dooku is a fascinating figure in the context of Obi-Wan's lineage specifically. He trained Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon trained Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan trained Anakin. And Dooku, somewhere along the way, became Darth Tyrannus, the Sith apprentice of Palpatine. There's a moment in the film where Dooku tells Obi-Wan that the Senate is under the control of a Sith Lord named Darth Sidious, which is entirely true, and Obi-Wan doesn't believe him. He passes the information along to the Council, but the framing of it, told to him by the enemy as a prisoner, makes it easy to discount. There's something almost darkly comic about Palpatine's patience. The truth is being delivered to people in positions to act on it, and nobody believes it because the source isn't trustworthy. One thing Attack of the Clones does very well, despite its various weaknesses as a film, is establish the particular texture of Obi-Wan and Anakin's relationship at this specific age. They're comfortable together, and they irritate each other in the comfortable way that close relationships allow. Their brief scenes together in the first act of the film, the conversation in the elevator on Coruscant, the discussions about Padme, have an ease to them that makes what eventually happens between them feel like the genuine loss it is. These two people like each other. They trust each other. That makes everything harder. There's a moment in Attack of the Clones that doesn't get discussed as much as it should, which is Obi-Wan's actual emotional response to discovering the clone army. He's professional about it. He asks the right questions, gathers the information, transmits it to Coruscant, but what he's looking at, if he lets himself think about it, is a room full of children. The Kaminoans show him the facilities where the clones are raised, trained, accelerated through childhood at twice the normal rate. These are human beings who are born into a destiny they didn't choose, who never had the option of refusing the role they were made for. It's not a moment the film dwells on, and Obi-Wan himself doesn't voice a great deal of discomfort with it because there's a crisis, and there's no time, and the army is already here. But it connects quietly to the questions the Clone Wars series would eventually raise more explicitly about what the Republic was doing by using these men, and what it meant that no one had really decided to do anything differently. Obi-Wan wasn't able to change that. He worked within it, but the way he treated individual clone troopers across the years of the war suggests he never stopped being aware of what they were. People who deserved better than the circumstances they'd been born into. The attack on Geonosis itself, the opening engagement of the Clone Wars, is chaotic and expensive, and doesn't resolve anything. The Separatists escape. Dooku escapes. The war that follows will last 3 years and cost millions of lives on both sides. In retrospect, Geonosis was less a military victory than the beginning of a very long, very costly draw. Obi-Wan couldn't have known that in the moment. Nobody could. They fought to what was in front of them. That was all that was available. The Clone Wars ran for 7 seasons across nearly a decade, and if you've only seen the films, it represents an enormous amount of story that you're missing. I want to be clear about this, not as a sales pitch, but as a genuine observation. The Clone Wars animated series did more for Obi-Wan Kenobi as a character than the 3 prequel films put together. It gave him time. It showed him moving through years of a grinding, complicated war, forming relationships, losing people, making mistakes, winning battles, losing battles, and slowly becoming the man who ends up in the cave on Tatooine. The films show you the before and the after. The series shows you the during, and the during is where most of a life actually happens. The war itself was vast, multiple theatres of conflict, hundreds of planets, years of fighting. Obi-Wan was a general in the Grand Army of the Republic, commanding clone troopers in addition to his role as a Jedi Master and diplomat. The title sat oddly on him in some ways. He wasn't naturally a military man in the way that some of the other Jedi were. He was thoughtful, methodical, always looking for the negotiated solution before the military one. His clone troops, the men of the 212th Attack Battalion under Commander Cody, genuinely liked him, which was not a given. Clone troopers were bred for war, and they respected competence, but they also responded to being treated like people rather than equipment, and Obi-Wan was good at that. The dry wit was in full form throughout this period. There are whole episodes built around Obi-Wan being captured by someone and having to talk his way out, which happened with a frequency that became its own running joke. He was genuinely brilliant at negotiation and at the particular skill of keeping someone talking until the situation changed. There's an arc early in the series where he and Anakin are held hostage by a space pirate named Hondo Ohnaka, and Obi-Wan just talks. He talks to Hondo about the wine, about his philosophy, about the nature of business. He keeps the conversation going while things are arranged. Hondo eventually lets them go, largely because he finds Obi-Wan interesting, which is the kind of diplomatic achievement that doesn't get memorialized in statues. Hondo Ohnaka is a supporting character I have a great deal of affection for, incidentally. He's a pirate and a rogue with no particular allegiance to anything except profit, and he kept crossing paths with Obi-Wan and Anakin throughout the war, usually ending up somewhere between an enemy and an inconvenient ally. He respected Obi-Wan in his way. Anakin had taken a Padawan of his own by the start of the series, a young Togruta named Ahsoka Tano, which was imposed on him by the Council, and which he resented for about 5 minutes before becoming completely devoted to her. Ahsoka is one of the great characters to come out of the animated era, and she was important to Obi-Wan too, though in a different way. He was fond of her. He was also aware, more clearly than Anakin perhaps, that her independence and her instinct to push against authority mirrored his own when he was young, and that this was both her best quality and one that would eventually cause real problems. The Mortis arc in Season 3 is worth a specific mention. It's deeply strange, even by Clone Wars standards. Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Ahsoka respond to a mysterious signal and find themselves drawn to a force realm called Mortis, which turns out to be inhabited by 3 beings who exist as personifications of the Force itself. A father who maintains balance, a son who embodies the dark side, and a daughter who embodies the light. The son wants Anakin to stay and replace the father in containing the son's darkness, having sensed that Anakin is the chosen one. It goes badly. The reason I mention this arc specifically is that on Mortis, Obi-Wan has a vision of Qui-Gon. Not a hallucination, but what appears to be an actual communication, Qui-Gon's voice warning him about what the Mortis beings might try to do. It's the first sign in canon that Qui-Gon is still out there somewhere, that his attempt to hold onto his consciousness after death was at least partially successful, and it's clearly meaningful to Obi-Wan in the way that any contact with a lost person is. He'd been missing his master for years by that point. One more Clone Wars element worth mentioning is Obi-Wan's relationship with the broader question of what the war was actually for. By the middle seasons, it was becoming clear to anyone paying attention that the war was not going well, in any simple moral sense. The Jedi were acting as military commanders, making tactical decisions that sent soldiers to die, navigating a conflict that kept expanding rather than resolving. There were individual victories, particular battles won, but the bigger picture was increasingly opaque. The Council sensed this without being able to name it. Obi-Wan, who had more direct experience of galactic politics than many of his colleagues, probably sensed it more keenly. He also had a particular relationship with the cost of the war on the people fighting it, meaning the clone troopers. He knew Cody well, genuinely well, and the broader 212th were men he'd worked alongside for years. There's something quietly devastating about what Order 66 eventually meant for that. Not just the immediate danger, but the understanding afterward that these men he'd trusted hadn't been able to choose otherwise. The biological compulsion overrode everything. It wasn't betrayal in any meaningful sense, which almost makes it worse because there's no one to be angry at. The Jedi in this period were fighting a war that was, unbeknownst to all of them, being engineered by the very man who claimed to be their Republic's greatest supporter. Palpatine had designed it to serve multiple purposes at once: exhaust the Republic, make the population grateful for military protection, create the legal framework for an authoritarian takeover, and push the Jedi into the role of soldiers rather than peacekeepers, which quietly corroded both their moral authority and their connection to the Force. Thinking about this now, at length, it remains one of the more astounding long cons in fiction. The Jedi High Council sensed something was wrong, but couldn't identify it. Obi-Wan was one of the members most committed to figuring out what they were missing, and he didn't manage it either. He was also, in those years, trying to be enough for Anakin. That was its own ongoing, quiet effort. He could see that Anakin was struggling with attachment in ways the Jedi Code made no room for. He probably knew more than he let on about Anakin and Padme. He didn't press because pressing would have put Anakin in the impossible position of either lying or admitting something that would have had formal consequences. Obi-Wan chose, deliberately, and I think with real love, not to make his brother choose. Whether that was the right decision is genuinely hard to say. It's the kind of choice that looks different depending on where you're standing. Now let's talk about the arc that undoes me every time, which is the Mandalore storyline of Season 5 and what it costs Obi-Wan. We've already touched on his history with Satine. The year they spent together in his youth, the feelings that never quite went away on either side, the choice he made to stay a Jedi. What the Clone Wars series does so well is bring them back into contact multiple times across the war, because Satine, as Duchess of Mandalore, is a relevant political figure, a leader of the Council of Neutral Systems, trying to keep dozens of worlds out of the conflict. Her and Obi-Wan's scenes in Season 2 have a warmth and a specificity that sells the history completely. Anakin is absolutely delighted by them, by the way. He sees the chemistry immediately and finds it both amusing and, I think, privately reassuring that even his principled, rules-following master had a complicated emotional life. Satine is a genuinely interesting character, entirely apart from her relationship with Obi-Wan. She's a pacifist leading a warrior people, trying to hold a difficult ideological position against pressure from all sides. She believes sincerely that Mandalore's tradition of violence has brought it nothing but suffering, and she has the particular stubbornness of someone who arrived at their convictions through experience rather than theory. She survived assassination attempts. She survived political coups. She kept holding the line. In another story, she'd be the hero. In this story, she gets used as a weapon against Obi-Wan. Darth Maul's return is one of the better ongoing storylines in the Clone Wars series. He survived being cut in half on Naboo through sheer, obsessive hatred, which is a characterization detail that tells you everything about him. He went mad, lived in a junk heap on a remote world, was found by his brother, Savage Opress, and eventually restored through Night Sister magic. What came back wasn't quite the silent, predatory assassin of the Phantom Menace. It was someone angrier, more conscious, and with an organized agenda. He wanted to build power, and he wanted revenge against Obi-Wan Kenobi. Maul orchestrated a takeover of Mandalore by teaming with the Death Watch, a Mandalorian faction that disagreed violently with Satine's pacifism. They manufactured chaos, staged attacks, played the factions against each other, and eventually Maul killed the Death Watch leader in single combat and by Mandalorian custom took his place as ruler. Satine was arrested, and then Maul made sure that Obi-Wan would hear about it. He came alone. The Council couldn't send help, Mandalore being technically neutral territory, and Obi-Wan didn't wait for Senate approval. He just went. Anakin's ship quietly borrowed, no backup. He almost saved her. They got close, but they were captured and brought back to Maul's throne room, and Maul made it absolutely clear what he intended. He told Obi-Wan he'd been waiting years for this, not to kill him, to make him share the pain that Maul had been carrying since the reactor shaft on Naboo. He used the Darksaber to kill Satine while Obi-Wan watched, and she died in his arms. And what Obi-Wan did in that moment is the thing I keep coming back to. Maul was trying to break him, trying to make him angry enough, hurt enough, that he'd fall, that he'd lash out from grief and rage, and give Maul the satisfaction of having succeeded. And Obi-Wan didn't give it to him. He held Satine. He heard her last words. He told Maul calmly that only the weak embrace the dark side. That strength is what allows you to resist it. He was in agony, obviously. The calm wasn't the absence of pain. It was pain held by something larger than itself. That's a different thing entirely, and it's the most important thing to understand about who Obi-Wan Kenobi is. He was rescued from his cell shortly after by Satine's sister, Bo-Katan, who told him to go back to the Republic and tell them what was happening. Obi-Wan noted that doing so would likely result in an invasion of Mandalore. Bo-Katan said Maul would die. Mandalore would survive. They always survive. And Obi-Wan left, carrying what he carried, back to a war that had no room for grief. He never talked about Satine to Anakin, apparently. The one person who might actually have understood what he was feeling. The one person who was also navigating an impossible relationship between love and duty. And Obi-Wan kept it all to himself. You can read that as emotional containment, which it was. You can also read it as a form of protection, keeping Anakin from understanding how much loss the Jedi Code could demand. There's some argument for that interpretation too. The Maul situation didn't end there, but we'll come back to where it does end. For now, it's enough to note that Obi-Wan carried Satine's death the same way he carried everything. Deeply, quietly, and without letting it change what he was. What happened to Mandalore after Obi-Wan left is a whole other story. Darth Sidious arrived on Mandalore shortly after, having sensed that Maul was building independent power that could threaten his own plans. He fought Maul and his brother Savage Opress, killed Savage, tortured, and captured Maul. The Mandalorian civil war continued without either of them providing resolution. Satine's sister, Bo-Katan, who had been a Death Watch commander and whose relationship with her sister was complicated, ended up as one of the key figures trying to hold Mandalore together after the chaos. Obi-Wan had told Bo-Katan he was sorry for her loss. She told him to go. Two people who had both loved Satine in different ways and who had no time to stand still in grief because the war required them elsewhere. There's a version of Satine's story where she is simply collateral damage, a political figure who got caught in a feud that wasn't really about her. But the Clone Wars doesn't let you read her that way. She was a genuine idealist who tried to build something better in conditions that made building nearly impossible. And she maintained her principles up to the moment Maul killed her. That's worth something, even if the galaxy didn't notice very much. Obi-Wan noticed, he carried it, and he went back to the war. The later seasons of the Clone Wars accumulate losses in the way that long wars tend to. Not all at once, and not always dramatically. Sometimes just the slow erosion of things that mattered. One of the stranger arcs in Season 4 involves Obi-Wan faking his own death. The setup is that there's a conspiracy to assassinate Chancellor Palpatine, which is an irony so enormous that it nearly collapses under its own weight given what we know later. The plan was engineered from within, and Obi-Wan had to go undercover to stop it. The cover required him to appear to die. He agreed to this. He let it be staged. He went through a public funeral, allowed a memorial hologram to be made. And Anakin, who was not told, grieved for him. That's the part that sits uncomfortably. The council decided that the mission required secrecy, that telling Anakin would compromise the operation or his emotional stability in the field. So they didn't tell him. And while Obi-Wan, alive, was working undercover in a physical disguise that involved an actual facial restructuring, Anakin was mourning his brother. You can make the argument that the decision was tactically correct. You can also look at it and see one more instance of the Jedi Order choosing institutional necessity over the emotional truth of a situation, and understand a little better why someone like Anakin might eventually feel that the Order didn't trust him. Obi-Wan was following the Council's guidance. He was also, in some sense, practicing the kind of deception by omission that the Order sometimes defaulted to when it couldn't find another way. They were reunited eventually, and the mission succeeded. The aftermath of their reunion is not something the series dwells on at length, which is itself a kind of statement about how these things get processed in wartime. You move on, there's always something else. The Ahsoka arc in Season 5 is where things get genuinely painful. A bombing at the Jedi Temple, followed by a series of events that led to Ahsoka being framed for the attack. The Council, under pressure from the military and the Senate, expelled her from the Order while the investigation was ongoing. The only counselor who clearly believed in her innocence throughout was Anakin, who investigated on his own and eventually found the real perpetrator. But by the time Ahsoka was exonerated, the damage was done. She was asked to return to the Order. She declined. She walked away. For Obi-Wan, this must have been its own particular grief, though he didn't show it. The Order had failed a promising student, had let institutional pressure override proper judgment, and had lost her because of it. He was on the Council. He bore some responsibility for that, and Anakin, he could see, was devastated by it in a way that Obi-Wan understood was partly about Ahsoka and partly about something deeper, a growing sense that the Order couldn't be trusted to protect the people it was supposed to protect. That sense in Anakin was not unfounded. That's the most painful thing about it. The very end of the Clone Wars era, covered in Season 7, runs parallel to the events of Revenge of the Sith. Ahsoka, having stayed out of the war for a period, is recruited by Bo-Katan to help liberate Mandalore from Maul's control. She takes a portion of the 501st Legion with her. Anakin and Obi-Wan have a moment before they're called away, the Battle of Coruscant beginning, the crisis that opens Revenge of the Sith, pulling them back. The last time Obi-Wan sees Ahsoka during the Clone Wars, he's saying goodbye in a hurry. She's going to Mandalore. He and Anakin are going to rescue the Chancellor. Neither of them knows what's about to happen. There's something about that rushed farewell, that incomplete goodbye, that feels like a small model of everything the war was. Nobody got to finish their sentences. Nobody got to say what they meant. There was always somewhere else to be. And then the war ended, not in victory or defeat in any traditional sense, but in betrayal. Order 66. But we'll get to that. There's a detail about the very end of the Clone Wars that I want to mention before we move on. When Ahsoka and the 501st were fighting Maul on Mandalore, Order 66 came through mid-battle. Rex, the clone commander she was with, warned her before fully succumbing to it. He bought her a few seconds. She escaped. Maul, with his own Force sensitivity, noticed the change in the clones and used the chaos to escape as well. So the final act of the Clone Wars, from Ahsoka's perspective, was fighting for her life on a ship full of men who'd been her colleagues, men she trusted, men who were trying to kill her without being able to stop themselves. She survived. She escaped into hiding. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan and Anakin were back on Coruscant, pulled away from the Mandalore operation by the news that Palpatine had been kidnapped. They'd said their quick goodbyes to Ahsoka. They'd gone. And they had no way of knowing, in that moment, that the next time any of them would see each other again, everything would be different. That's the shape of a lot of the Clone Wars endings. Not dramatic revelations, but interrupted conversations. Not proper farewells, but rushed ones, followed by everything that made the proper farewell impossible. Since we're on the later Clone Wars, let's talk about something that the series does, which I find genuinely interesting, which is Obi-Wan's evolving relationship with the question of peace. He was always, from the beginning, someone who preferred negotiation to combat. General Kenobi the soldier was never quite where he lived. But the Clone Wars forced him into sustained military command, into making decisions that sent men to die, into a logic of acceptable losses and tactical necessity that sat badly with what he was. The animated series doesn't make a big dramatic thing of this. It's in the texture. The way he pauses before certain orders, the way he talks to the clones, the way he consistently tries to find the diplomatic exit even when the situation has clearly passed the point where diplomacy is available. There's a version of Obi-Wan that the war could have made harder, more comfortable with violence, more willing to treat the horror of it as simply the cost of doing business. It didn't. He remained stubbornly the person who thought there should have been another way, even when there clearly wasn't. That stubbornness might be his most important quality. Not the fighting skill, not the force sensitivity, not the diplomatic gift. The refusal to stop believing that understanding was possible, even in a galaxy that kept proving him wrong. The opening of Revenge of the Sith is genuinely one of the great sequences in the Star Wars films, and it's one I think is sometimes underappreciated because of how much is happening around it. General Grievous, the military commander of the Separatist forces, has kidnapped Chancellor Palpatine above Coruscant. The Battle of Coruscant is underway, space combat everywhere, and in the middle of it, Obi-Wan and Anakin are flying together, bantering, watching out for each other, operating with the ease of two people who've been doing this together for over a decade. There's a lightness to it that you have to notice because it's the last time you see them like this. Count Dooku is aboard the flagship. Obi-Wan and Anakin fight him together, and Dooku, for the second time, wins the round against Obi-Wan easily. Anakin gets him down, and then Palpatine tells Anakin to kill him, an unarmed prisoner, and Anakin does it, and Obi-Wan is unconscious on the floor and doesn't see it happen. That detail matters more than it might seem in the moment. Obi-Wan doesn't know about the execution of Dooku. He knows about plenty of other things, but not that. He doesn't know that Palpatine has been slowly, carefully drawing Anakin closer for months, feeding him fears about Padme dying in childbirth, offering him the dark side as a solution to grief. The grooming is patient and thorough, and Obi-Wan is not aware of it. He knows Anakin is troubled. He doesn't know how far it has gone. He goes to Utapau to find General Grievous, which is his assignment while Anakin stays on Coruscant near the Chancellor. The fight with Grievous involves Obi-Wan dropping from a great height onto Grievous's large wheel bike, which is a very Obi-Wan move, the kind of improvisation that looks insane in the moment and works completely. He kills Grievous ultimately with a blaster, which he immediately describes to the clones as uncivilized. He'd used blasters in the Clone Wars regularly. He was just doing a bit. It's interesting that he found the bit worth doing, even in the middle of a battle. Some people just never stop being themselves. And then Commander Cody's helmet received a signal. Order 66. Every clone trooper in the galaxy received the same command, a biological imperative built into them from birth, activating without warning. Kill the Jedi. Cody had followed Obi-Wan for years. He trusted Obi-Wan. He was probably, in some meaningful sense, fond of him, and none of that mattered at all because the kill order overrode everything that came before. The clones weren't choosing this. They were executing a directive that bypassed their will entirely, and that's the truly horrifying thing about Order 66 when you've watched the series. You've seen these men as individuals. You know they'd have refused if they could. They couldn't. Obi-Wan fell into the water below and survived by playing dead. He was one of very few Jedi to do so. Meeting Yoda on Coruscant, in hiding, learning the scale of it, going to the temple and seeing the recordings, the holographic records of what had happened inside, Anakin killing everyone, working systematically through the temple's corridors. There are younglings in those recordings. The narrator of this story is going to say that once and not return to it, because there's nothing useful to say beyond acknowledging that it happened and that Obi-Wan saw it. He went to Padme because that was the only way to find Anakin. She was carrying twins, near term, and she went to Anakin on Mustafar, even knowing what Obi-Wan had told her. She loved him. She thought she could reach him. She couldn't. Obi-Wan had stowed away on her ship and waited outside. He emerged and Anakin immediately accused Padme of bringing him there as part of a trap, force-choked her, turned to Obi-Wan. The fight on Mustafar is long and exhausting and shot against lava and fire and everything collapsing around them, which is entirely appropriate as a visual metaphor. Obi-Wan wasn't trying to kill Anakin. He was, I think, trying to stop him and hoping at some point to break through to whatever was still Anakin inside. He didn't manage the second part. He managed the first part, barely, when Anakin made the mistake of jumping to order him on the high ground. You were the chosen one. It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them. Bring balance to the Force, not leave it in darkness. He left him there. He took Anakin's lightsaber, which becomes significant in ways that take decades to resolve. He went back to Padme, who survived long enough to have the twins and name them Luke and Leia, before the injuries Anakin had inflicted took her. Then came the delivery, Luke to Owen and Beru Lars on Tatooine, where he would grow up without knowing who he was. Leia to Bail Organa of Alderaan, to be raised as a princess with every advantage, and Obi-Wan to the desert to wait. He went to his dead master's home planet to watch over a child who didn't know he existed. That's the assignment he chose, and it tells you something about who he was and what he thought he owed. He'd failed Anakin. He could not fail Anakin's son. The Republic was gone. The Empire was beginning. The Jedi were almost entirely extinct. Everything he'd given his life to had ended, and he went to the desert. There's one more thing about the end of Revenge of the Sith that the film doesn't spend long with, but which matters for understanding where Obi-Wan is when we next see him. Before going into exile, he recorded a message and broadcast it through the Force, a warning to any surviving Jedi to avoid the temple. The temple was still standing, still there as a building on Coruscant, but it had been transformed into Vader's headquarters, and any Jedi who went back to it would walk into a trap. Obi-Wan wanted to prevent that, so he sent the message, which any Force-sensitive Jedi might hear. The recording and the message are shown in the Disney Plus series. The specific wording of it: do not return to the temple. The war is over. The time of the Jedi is over for now. That last phrase, for now, is worth noting. He didn't say permanently, he said for now. Even at his lowest point, even handing one twin to a moisture farmer on a desert planet and the other to a senator on a planet that would eventually be blown up, he apparently had enough left in him to think in terms of the long view. For now, not forever. Yoda told him before they parted on Polis Massa that Qui-Gon had returned, that he had more to teach, that in his solitude on Tatooine, Obi-Wan would not be alone. He would have his master back, eventually. The thread that had been cut on Naboo would be picked up. That's what he carried into the desert. Grief, obviously. Failure, obviously. But also the promise of eventual contact with the one person he'd most wanted to hear. Something to wait for, out in the sand. Sometimes, waiting is all there is. And knowing that something is at the end of it makes the waiting possible. Tatooine is not, by any measure, a comfortable planet. It's 2 suns and vast tracts of sand, and a climate that seems to exist in a permanent state of hostile inconvenience. The inhabitants who do well there do so by being extremely practical and extremely stubborn. The ones who don't do well leave, or die, or become the Jedi equivalent of a hermit living in a rock formation in the Jundland wastes and calling himself Ben. Obi-Wan Kenobi, in exile, became Ben. It wasn't a complicated alias. He kept his surname, which was either confidence or exhaustion. He found a modest cave dwelling. He found work at some points at a local meat processing facility, which is one of those details about the exile years that the Disney Plus series added, and which feels absolutely right. Of course he found quiet, dull, honest work. Of course he made himself as small and unremarkable as possible. He was hiding, but he was also, I think, punishing himself a little. This man who had been a general and a council member and one of the most respected Jedi of his generation, slicing moisture-farmed meat in the desert. There's a penance quality to it that feels consistent with someone carrying the weight he was carrying. He watched Luke from a distance. Owen Lars had made his position clear. Stay away. Owen's reasoning is complicated, and the Disney Plus series goes into it. But the short version is that Owen had watched Anakin Skywalker's story, and he did not want it repeated with his nephew. He didn't trust Jedi, and he didn't trust this particular Jedi to leave Luke to a normal life. Obi-Wan respected that mostly. He'd bring small gifts occasionally, apparently, and Owen would throw them back. But he didn't insert himself. He watched from a distance, checking in, making sure the boy was safe, and then going back to his cave. The internal life of those years is something we have to mostly infer, but the Disney Plus series gives us one very specific detail. Obi-Wan tried repeatedly to reach Qui-Gon's Force spirit and failed. He'd meditate, he'd call out, nothing came, and that failure after everything else was an ongoing quiet wound. His master had apparently succeeded in something unprecedented, had managed to hold on to his consciousness after death, had communicated with Yoda in the years after his death. But when Obi-Wan tried to reach him, there was silence. You can read that as the Force having its own timing. You can read it as Obi-Wan being in such a state of grief and disconnection that he couldn't receive what was being sent. You can read it as Qui-Gon choosing when to appear for reasons of his own. The show suggests all of these possibilities without committing to one. What it commits to is the loneliness of Obi-Wan's experience of it. He'd been trying to reconnect with his master for years and getting nothing in return. Something else worth noting about this period. Obi-Wan quietly developed a kind of understanding with the Tusken Raiders of the local region. He learned their language well enough to communicate, or at least to signal non-threat. He understood their movements and their territory. This is very much in character for someone whose instinct has always been toward understanding rather than exclusion. The Tuskens were treated by most Tatooine residents as dangerous wildlife. Obi-Wan treated them as neighbours with a legitimate claim to their own land. There's something satisfying about that detail. What's also worth sitting with is the question of what Obi-Wan did with his time, intellectually and spiritually, during those years. The Jedi Order had essentially been an all-consuming life. Missions, the Council, the Clone Wars, the constant demands of active service. And now there was none of that. There was silence and sand and a small cave and a boy he could only observe from a distance. Yoda had gone to Dagobah, where he was apparently meditating and working through what Qui-Gon had begun to uncover. The thread of that knowledge had to be picked up between them, the fragmentary guidance that came through Qui-Gon's intermittent presence from wherever he now existed. Obi-Wan in his cave had time to think, and to wait, and to begin, slowly, to work on that connection, even when it seemed like nothing was coming back. The years passed. Luke grew from an infant to a toddler to a child. The Empire consolidated. The Inquisitors, dark side Force users who served Darth Vader and existed specifically to hunt down surviving Jedi, began their work across the galaxy. Some Jedi survivors were found and killed. Some went deeper into hiding. A few, on the edges of known space, found ways to persist. And on Tatooine, an increasingly gaunt man in an old brown robe, lived in a cave and watched a blonde boy run around the Lars homestead and tried not to be noticed and tried not to fall apart and tried, in the evenings, to hear his dead master's voice. The Disney Plus series begins a decade into the exile, and that's when everything breaks open again. But before we get there, it's worth sitting with that period a little longer, because that is a very long time. Luke was a child when Obi-Wan arrived on Tatooine, and a young man of 19 when Obi-Wan left it. That's the full span of a childhood and adolescence. Obi-Wan watched that happen from a distance, in a desert, alone. There were presumably other Jedi survivors scattered across the galaxy during this period. Some of them we know about from Rebels and other sources. Cal Kestis, Kanan Jarrus, a handful of others who found ways to persist. Obi-Wan was aware, probably, that he wasn't the only one. But he didn't seek them out, and they didn't come to Tatooine. The job was here, watching Luke, and the job took precedence over personal connection, as it always had. Something I find quietly interesting about the exile years is how they complicate the image of Obi-Wan as someone who's always certain of his path. He wasn't. The Disney Plus series shows a man who had essentially stopped trusting himself, who wasn't sure his judgment could be relied on after what had happened with Anakin. He'd been wrong about things. Catastrophically wrong in the sense that the things he'd been wrong about had contributed to the fall of the Republic and the rise of an empire. That weight was present in him in a way that the film's brief portrayal of old Ben hadn't fully communicated. The cave was, in some sense, appropriate, not as punishment exactly, but as a kind of deliberate smallness. He didn't need to be more than a watchman. He didn't need to be impressive or wise or effective in any large way. He just needed to be there, and he was there every day, through Tatooine's relentless twin suns, through the sand and the heat and the occasional Tusken patrol, through the years. There are reports, never quite confirmed in canon, that he sometimes went into the town of Anchorhead or Mos Eisley on errands. That he was known locally as a harmless, if somewhat eccentric old settler. That some of the moisture farmers knew him vaguely as Ben, the quiet man from the Jundland wastes who kept to himself. Whether that's accurate or just the kind of detail that fans generate to fill in gaps, it feels right. He would have had to buy food occasionally. He would have had to move through the world a little, enough to not completely lose the thread of ordinary life. What he was doing internally during all of that, the meditation, the slow patient work of learning how to hear Qui-Gon's voice, the processing of everything that had happened, is harder to know. The Disney Plus series suggests it wasn't going well, and that for a significant stretch, he'd essentially stopped trying. That makes sense. There's only so long you can reach out for something and get silence before you put your hand down. Let's talk about the Disney Plus show, because I have some feelings about it, and also, it's genuinely worth discussing in some depth. The series aired in 2022 and was 6 episodes long, developed originally as a film and then expanded into a mini-series. It brought Ewan McGregor back as Obi-Wan and Hayden Christensen back as Darth Vader, which was a significant thing for a certain generation of Star Wars fans. Deborah Chow directed all 6 episodes, which gave it a consistency of tone that miniseries can sometimes lack. The Obi-Wan we meet at the start of the series is a man who has been gradually erasing himself. He works, he eats, he sleeps in a cave. He leaves a small toy for Luke occasionally, and Owen throws it back. He's going through the motions of existing without quite inhabiting it. He's stopped trying to reach Qui-Gon. He's essentially stopped using the Force in any active way, like a musician who's left their instrument covered in a corner. For so long they're no longer sure their hands would remember what to do. The Inquisitors arrive on Tatooine. They're hunting a Jedi named Nari, a survivor who's been making quiet attempts at a normal life. Obi-Wan meets Nari, tells him to hide, to not draw attention, that the time for the Jedi to fight is over. Nari doesn't want to hear this. Obi-Wan finds his hanging corpse the next day. The Inquisitors are not subtle. and then Reva, the third sister, makes her play. Reva Savanda is an inquisitor with an obsession. She's been hunting Obi-Wan Kenobi specifically, for reasons that aren't immediately clear, but turn out to involve the Temple massacre she witnessed as a child. She survived Order 66 by playing dead. She became an inquisitor to get close enough to Darth Vader to kill him in revenge for what he'd done. It's a tragic arc, and Moses Ingram played it with a rawness that I think the show sometimes didn't quite deserve in terms of how it wrote her into corners. Her plan to draw Obi-Wan out was simple and effective. Kidnap 10-year-old Leia Organa, knowing that the connection between Kenobi and the Organas ran deep enough that he couldn't ignore it. She was right. Bail Organa came to Tatooine personally. He stood in the desert and said, "Please, old friend, for her, one last fight." And Obi-Wan dug up his lightsaber from a hiding spot in the sand, along with Anakin's, which he'd also kept, and got on a transport. The city planet Daiyu was where Leia had been taken. It's a place of perpetual neon and noise and industry. The kind of city that exists in Star Wars to convey that not all worlds are deserts or forests, that there's an enormous amount of ordinary, chaotic, badly lit human experience somewhere in all this galaxy too. Obi-Wan landed there and was immediately out of his depth. He's been in a cave for years. He doesn't know this world. He's older and he's slow, and a young spice dealer immediately spots him as someone who doesn't know where he's going. He finds Leia. She is 10 years old and immediately and completely her mother's daughter, which is to say she is not particularly impressed by him and has opinions about everything. She questions him, argues with him, notes that he's old and beat up looking, and runs away from him twice. He buys her a pair of gloves in a market stall because she'd admired them, and the moment is so small and so complete that it says everything about what kind of man he is when he's not in survival mode. He just bought the kids some gloves. Leia asks him his name. He tells her Ben. She trusts him anyway, eventually, in the way that children sometimes trust the right person before they have a reason to. The Grand Inquisitor arrives to shut down the whole operation and take the credit from Reva, which was not in Reva's plan. She stabs him rather than let him take over, which is a spectacular professional failure. But it creates enough chaos for Obi-Wan and Leia to escape. On the transport, Leia asks what's wrong. He just says, "Anakin," because Reva had told him, screamed it at him before he got away. "He's alive, Obi-Wan. He survived Mustafar. He's Darth Vader." Ewan McGregor's face in that moment is doing a lot of work. The understanding that the man he'd left for dead on a lava bank had not died, that everything he'd feared had not ended on Mustafar, but had continued into something he'd been avoiding knowing about for a decade, and that it was now directly relevant to his immediate situation. All of that is in his face at once. It's a good piece of acting in a moment that the script mostly just hands him and trusts him to carry. The series had made a point of establishing that Obi-Wan had essentially shut down spiritually, disconnected from the Force, not meditating, not practicing, and the shock of this revelation, of Vader being alive and looking for him, is in some ways the thing that begins, very slowly and very painfully, to wake him back up. Not all at once. He's still rusty, he's still scared, but something is moving again. Leia, for what it's worth, later describes him as the bravest man she's ever known, and she knew a lot of brave people. There's something in the Obi-Wan and young Leia dynamic that I think the show handled surprisingly well, given how easy it would have been to make it saccharine. Leia at 10 is already exactly who she'll be at 19. Quick, skeptical, principled, and constitutionally unable to let anything go without questioning it. She asks Obi-Wan why he moves like he's afraid of something. She tells him he's not very good at being a farmer, his cover story at one point. She says he reminds her of her father, meaning Bail, and that's the highest compliment she knows how to give. She's a remarkably well-written child character in a franchise that's had mixed results with those. And Obi-Wan, for his part, is clearly not quite sure what to do with her in the beginning, and then is quietly besotted by her by the end. He buys her the gloves. He lies awake in the transport, listening to her chatter. He tells her she reminds him of someone who was a leader and was fearless and stubborn, and she asks if it's a Jedi, and he says no, she died a long time ago. He's thinking of Padme, probably. Maybe a little of Satine, the women who were brave in ways he wasn't quite capable of, who chose their principles without the comfortable structure of an order to hold them. He tells Leia at one point that the Force surrounds everyone, living things, and that she's already strong with it even if she doesn't know it yet. It's a gentle moment that recontextualizes the Leia of A New Hope, who receives Obi-Wan's help through a holographic message as if he's an old friend of her father's. He is, and he's also someone who once bought her gloves in a market and told her the Force was with her, years before she understood what either of those things meant. The back half of the series is where it settles into itself. Mapuzo, a mining planet, was the next step in Obi-Wan and Leia's journey towards safety. They'd been directed there by Haja, a Coruscant con artist who'd been pretending to be a Jedi for money, and found himself, somewhat against his better judgment, actually doing the right thing when it counted. He directed them to a contact, part of a network called the Hidden Path, which moves surviving Jedi and Force sensitives to safety across the Empire. The Imperial officer who helped them on Mapuzo was Tala Durith, and she's one of those supporting characters who does an enormous amount of work in limited screen time. She was someone who had served the Empire and discovered, through witnessing what the Empire did, that she couldn't keep serving it. So she stayed inside and helped people get out, which is the most quietly dangerous thing she could have done. She didn't survive the series, and her loss is one of the show's more effective emotional moments. But before they could get through, Vader arrived. Vader's presence on Mapuzo, hunting Obi-Wan personally, is depicted in a way that I think is effective specifically because of what it tells us about both of them. Vader walks into the village and starts hurting people to draw Obi-Wan out, which is exactly the kind of tactic that the Anakin Skywalker Obi-Wan knew would never have considered. The gap between who Anakin was and who Vader is becomes physically visible in how Vader moves through space. He's deliberate, patient. There's no conflict in him, no hesitation. He knows Obi-Wan is there, and he's going to find him. Obi-Wan intervenes to stop the slaughter of the villagers, and their first meeting in over a decade is not a duel of equals. Obi-Wan hesitates, even drawing his lightsaber. Vader is calm and organized and has clearly thought about this moment. He drags Obi-Wan through a bank of burning embers using the Force, and the visual is deliberate. He's making Obi-Wan feel what he felt on Mustafar. Not in a rage, with intention. The Imperial officer with a loader bot pulls Obi-Wan to safety, while Vader lets it happen, confident enough to let his prey retreat and find him again later. Obi-Wan escapes to Jabim, half-burned, shaken to his core. The fortress on Nur was next. Leia had been recaptured by Reva, taken to the Inquisitor base built underwater on the ocean moon. Rescue mission. Obi-Wan, Tala, some help from the wider Hidden Path network. They get Leia out. Tala dies doing it. The Jedi survivors being held in the facility, suspended in stasis, are a grim image that the show doesn't let you look away from. The Empire's project wasn't just to kill the Jedi, it was to collect and contain and extinguish them systematically. Reva's backstory emerges in full in the final episodes. She'd been there the night of Order 66, a youngling who survived by pretending to be dead and watching everything happen. She became an Inquisitor to get close to Vader, to eventually get close enough to kill him. When Vader figures this out, he nearly kills her instead, leaving her for dead on the planet's surface, which is when she makes one final desperate choice. Find Luke Skywalker on Tatooine and hurt him. Owen and Beru Lars, to their considerable credit, put up a fight. Owen in particular, who had spent years resenting Jedi and wanting this man to stay away from his family, turns out to be entirely willing to stand in a doorway with a blaster and face down an Inquisitor for the child in his care. There's something in that which redeems a lot of his gruffness. Reva catches Luke, and then she has him, and she can't do it. She drops the weapon. She goes to Obi-Wan and she tells him that she failed, expecting him to condemn her. He asks what she chose. She chose not to become Vader. He tells her that means she hasn't failed her lost friends. The final confrontation with Vader, on a dark, unnamed rocky world. And this time, Obi-Wan is present in a way he hadn't been on Maputo. Something has settled in him through all of this, through the pain and the fear and the grief being dragged back up to the surface. He is, in these final minutes of the show, the Obi-Wan Kenobi that the prequels promised. The Force is moving through him cleanly again. He fights without hesitation. He wins. He cracks Vader's mask with a rock fall, and through the cracked mask he sees Anakin's scarred face and hears Anakin's voice. And Vader tells him he didn't destroy Anakin Skywalker. Anakin did it to himself. And Obi-Wan says, "Then my friend is truly dead." Goodbye, Darth. Not Anakin, Darth. He names what's actually there, acknowledges the truth of it, and lets the grief he'd been carrying turn into something like acceptance. Vader lets him go, which says something about Vader too. And then, in the final moments of the show, walking back through the desert, Obi-Wan hears Qui-Gon's voice, and turns around, and there he is, Liam Neeson returning to a role he first played 23 years earlier, standing in the Tatooine light, alive in the Force. He'd always been there, Qui-Gon tells him. He just wasn't ready to see him. I don't mind admitting that I find that moment affecting every time. Not in a particularly dramatic way, just in the quiet way of something that has been waiting a long time finally arriving. Obi-Wan rides off into the desert to continue watching over Luke. And this time, when he does it, there's someone there on the other side of the silence. There's one more confrontation with Darth Maul in Obi-Wan's story, and it happens years after the Disney Plus series, in a single episode of the animated Star Wars Rebels called Twin Suns. Rebels is set roughly 4 years before A New Hope, and follows a crew of rebels on a ship called the Ghost, one of the cells of the early rebellion. For our purposes, the important thing is that Maul has been drifting through the series as a recurring antagonist, increasingly unstable, obsessed with one remaining purpose, finding Obi-Wan Kenobi. He'd been working backward through old Sith lore, following a path of ancient knowledge, and arrived at the conclusion that something important was hidden on Tatooine. He set a trap using a Force-sensitive young man named Ezra Bridger, who is the main character of the series, feeding him a shared vision through a Sith holocron to draw him to the desert. The episode takes its time. There's no urgency in it. Ezra travels to Tatooine on Maul's trail and ends up wandering the dunes disoriented, talking to a figure in the distance who turns out to be Obi-Wan. The two of them sit and have a quiet, careful conversation, Obi-Wan figuring out quickly that this is Maul's handiwork, Ezra not quite understanding what he's walked into. The desert is vast and quiet, and the twin suns are setting, and it's genuinely beautiful, in the way that Tatooine is sometimes beautiful in Star Wars when the camera lets itself slow down and look. What I find affecting about this episode is how composed Obi-Wan is throughout. Not detached, not closed off, just settled. He's been in this desert for over a decade by this point. He knows every shape of it. He's made a kind of peace with it that the man who arrived here grieving and broken could not have imagined. And when he sends Ezra home, it isn't a dismissal. He's genuinely kind about it. He tells him his place is with his family, his crew, the people who need him. There's something fatherly in how he says it. Then Maul arrives, and Obi-Wan knows it's coming. He doesn't seem frightened. He seems, if anything, prepared in the way you can only be prepared for something you've had years to think about. Obi-Wan found Ezra wandering Tatooine in the night, lost. He helped him. He sent him home, firmly and kindly, telling him that his place was with his crew, his family. He wasn't unkind about it. He just knew that Ezra being there was Maul's doing, and that what was about to happen needed to happen, without bystanders. Maul found him after dark. The confrontation between them is nothing like the duel of the fates in The Phantom Menace. There are no dramatic acrobatics and no long corridors, and no swelling music building to a climax. It's two men in the desert at night, and it lasts about 5 seconds. Maul tries to get under his skin first. He asks what Obi-Wan is protecting on this planet. He figures out it's a child. He calls it a hope. Obi-Wan ignites his lightsaber. Maul ignites his. And in the exchange that follows, Obi-Wan reads a feint that Maul has been using since Naboo. A feint that had killed Qui-Gon, and counters it. 3 moves. Maul is down, mortally wounded. He dies in Obi-Wan's arms. He asks if the boy hidden here is the one. The chosen one? Obi-Wan says yes, and Maul dying says, then he will avenge us. Both of them. The boy will avenge both of them. I find this small quiet death more resonant than almost anything else in the saga. Maul spent 30+ years of his life destroyed by hatred, by the obsession with revenge that had kept him alive when he probably should have died on Naboo. And in his last seconds, the hatred releases, and what's left is something that looks almost like hope. He and Obi-Wan, enemies from their first meeting, end in the same position they've occupied before in the story. Obi-Wan holding someone as they die, saying what small thing there is to be said. He will avenge us. There's a we in that. Some kind of acknowledgement between them that they were caught in the same machinery, that both of them had been shaped and damaged by the same dark force moving through history, that there was something on the other side of it that might be better. Obi-Wan covers the body with a cloth. He looks out at the Lars homestead in the distance, where Luke is growing up. He goes back to watching. There's a detail I want to note about where exactly Maul dies, which is in Obi-Wan's arms. Not alone in the sand, not struck down mid-fight from a distance, but held by the person who's been his enemy, and his obsession for 3 decades. Obi-Wan could have left him there. He doesn't. He stays with him until it's over. The same way he stayed with Qui-Gon. The same way he stayed with Satine. Whatever their history, whatever Maul did, Obi-Wan doesn't let him die alone. That's not mercy as a strategic decision. That's just who he is. The we in Maul's last words is worth sitting with. Then he will avenge us. Maul had spent his whole life hating Obi-Wan, hating the Jedi, hating the order that he'd been denied and then weaponized against. And in his final moment, without planning it, he included Obi-Wan in his hope, found them on the same side after everything. The Force has a strange sense of resolution sometimes. The thing about the Twin Suns episode that I keep returning to is how much is communicated in how short it is. Obi-Wan is not the same man who fought Maul on Naboo or faced him down on Mandalore. He's settled. He's been through the worst of it and come out the other side into something quieter. The fight is over so quickly because he'd already done the hard work of understanding it. He knew exactly what he was going to do when the moment came. He'd had years to think about it. Some battles end with fire and spectacle. This one ended in the sand in about 30 seconds, and it was perfect. The show Rebels doesn't linger on it. Ezra goes home, as instructed. The brief shot of Obi-Wan watching over the Lars homestead in the closing moments is the last we see of him in that phase of his life. A figure in a robe on a ridge in the twilight. It's a quietly satisfying image, for the same reason the Twin Suns episode as a whole works. It's proportional. The fight was what it needed to be, and no longer. The quiet afterward is what it needed to be. No fanfare. It's also worth noting that this is the last time in the canonical story that Obi-Wan has to fight anyone. From the Twin Suns episode forward, the only remaining confrontation is the Death Star, and as we've established, that one is a choice rather than a fight. He's done with fighting in some sense. Everything after this is waiting, and then dying, and then teaching from beyond it, which is not a diminishment, it's a completion. There's a scene near the beginning of A New Hope, not the very beginning, but close to it, where C-3PO and R2-D2 are wandering the Tatooine desert after escaping from Leia's ship, and they're bickering and hopeless and heading in completely different directions, and a hooded figure is watching from a distance on a ridge. He watches them pass. He doesn't intervene. He just watches. That's Obi-Wan. That's what he's been doing for 19 years. The film was made in 1977, and Alec Guinness played Ben Kenobi as a man of tremendous stillness. There's a quality of settledness in his performance that reads differently once you know the full story, because you understand now that the stillness was earned. He had processed so much loss and arrived on the other side of it at something like peace. Not happiness exactly. Peace. The two things aren't the same. Luke finds him after the Tusken Raiders, who for reasons we can only speculate about, simply let Luke go rather than attacking him the way they would normally have. Obi-Wan brings him to his hut. He gives Luke Anakin's lightsaber, the one he'd been keeping for him all those years in the sand. He says his father was a Jedi Knight, that he was a good friend, that Darth Vader hunted down and murdered him. All of which is technically true from a certain angle, if you allow for the argument that the man Obi-Wan trained and loved was genuinely destroyed on Mustafar and replaced by something else. Vader himself, in the Disney Plus series, essentially confirmed this interpretation, so it was never quite the lie it looked like. He tells Luke about the Force. He says it binds the galaxy together, that it's an energy field created by all living things. Luke tries it with a training remote and the helmet down on the Falcon and deflects 3 blasts. He's been practicing for about 45 minutes, and he's already doing it. Anakin's son, the Death Star. Obi-Wan goes to disable the tractor beam, while Han and Luke and the droids rescue Leia. And then he encounters Vader again, for the last time in any conventional sense. The duel between them on the Death Star is famously brief and undramatic compared to what had come before, and that's entirely deliberate. These two men have already said everything there is to say to each other. The fight on Mustafar was their real final confrontation. This one is something else. Obi-Wan goes into it knowing what he's going to do, or at least willing to let it happen if the moment arrives. He sees Luke watching from across the hangar. He sees Han and Leia and the droids at the Falcon. He looks at Vader. He raises his lightsaber, and then he lets it fall. He becomes one with the Force. His body vanishes into his robe, and there's nothing there. Vader strikes where he was and hits empty cloth, and Luke hears his voice. The decision to die rather than fight on was not passivity. It's worth being clear about that, because it sometimes gets read that way. As an old man giving up. It wasn't. It was Obi-Wan understanding that his usefulness to Luke was going to be greater from the other side of death than from this side. He'd been learning for decades how Qui-Gon had done it, how a Jedi could retain their consciousness after death. He was ready. He chose the moment, and he became exactly what Luke needed him to be. A voice, a guide, a teacher who could reach him anywhere, in any moment, without the complication of a physical body needing things. Luke fires the shot that destroys the Death Star because Obi-Wan tells him to trust the Force. That's it. That's the intervention that saves the rebellion. An old man who's been dead for about 6 hours, whispering into the ear of a boy he'd watched from a distance his whole life, telling him to let go and trust what he knows. Pretty good for a hermit in a cave. There's a conversation Obi-Wan and Luke have on the Millennium Falcon during the transit to Alderaan, before they find out Alderaan is already gone, that I always want to spend more time with. Luke's just starting to understand what the Force actually is, and Obi-Wan is teaching him in the way he's always taught, with patience, with specificity, without overwhelming. He tells Luke that the Force surrounds us and penetrates us and binds the galaxy together. It's a beautiful articulation of something quite large, compressed into a few sentences. And then he puts the blast helmet on Luke and turns his attention inward, while Luke practices with the remote. And there's something quietly moving about watching Obi-Wan be a teacher again. He'd been without a student for all that time. He'd been without meaningful purpose in that specific way for years. And here he is, back to the thing he was actually good at. The thing that wasn't soldiering or politics or surviving, but simply helping someone learn. The Alderaan moment is terrible. The planet destroyed, Obi-Wan sensing it through the Force, a great disturbance, like millions of voices crying out. He knows what it means before anyone tells him. And he tells Luke, quietly, to put the remote away for now. He sits with what he's just felt. He doesn't fall apart, but he allows himself to acknowledge it, which is something. Leia is on the Death Star. He had no way of knowing that she'd survived. Another loss that hadn't quite resolved. His walk through the Death Star to disable the tractor beam is the last stretch of his life that he spends as a living person in a physical body, and the film does very little with it visually because the film is following other people. He moves through corridors, he finds the panel, he disables it, and then he hears the sound of a lightsaber igniting and turns around, and there is Vader. The exchange between them before the fight is brief. "I've been waiting for you, Obi-Wan. We meet again, at last. The circle is now complete. When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master." And Obi-Wan says, "Only a master of evil, Darth." He still has the line, even now. Then he sees Luke watching, and something changes in his face. And he raises his lightsaber and looks directly at Vader and steps back and lets it happen. There are only a handful of moments in the Star Wars saga that genuinely take my breath away, regardless of how many times I've seen them. That's one of them. The absolute deliberateness of it. The choice. We've talked already about Qui-Gon's project, the long effort to recover the lost technique of retaining consciousness after death. He was still practicing it when Maul killed him on Naboo, which means he had to refine it while being dead, which is a peculiar kind of dedication that feels appropriately Qui-Gon. He taught what he could to Yoda in the years after, communicating from wherever he existed in the Force. Yoda passed elements of it onto Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan spent all those years of exile working at it, and the Disney Plus series established that the connection wasn't fully there until he found his way back to himself emotionally. You can't learn to let go of the self after death if you haven't made peace with who the self was. The Empire Strikes Back opens 3 years after the Battle of Yavin, and Luke is on the ice planet Hoth. After the rebel base is attacked by the Empire, and Luke is left half frozen in a blizzard, Obi-Wan appears to him. A Force ghost, calm and luminous, standing in the snow, giving him a direction. Go to the Dagobah system. Find Yoda. He says it with the particular warmth of someone who loves the person they're talking to, and then he fades. It's a small moment, but it matters because it establishes what Obi-Wan's existence is now. He can appear, he can speak, he can guide, he can't fight and he can't carry luggage, and he can't pilot a ship. His interventions are limited to being present and saying things, which in his case is actually quite powerful. On Dagobah, after Luke has met Yoda and begun his training, there are moments where Obi-Wan's voice comes to Yoda as well, the two of them in communication, making decisions together about what Luke should and shouldn't be told at various stages. That aspect of the arrangement is one I find a bit uncomfortable, honestly. There's a lot of discussion between Obi-Wan and Yoda about what Luke is ready for, which is a reasonable question, but one they answer with rather a lot of secrecy. The decision not to tell Luke about Vader being his father is one they make together, and they get it wrong. The truth comes out from Vader directly, and the context is terrible. Obi-Wan appears to Luke again on Dagobah in Return of the Jedi, and this is the conversation where Luke confronts him. He asks why Obi-Wan told him Vader had killed his father, and Obi-Wan says, "What I told you was true, from a certain point of view." And then, when Luke pushes back, Obi-Wan says, "Many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view." I've gone back and forth on this scene over the years. There's a version of it where Obi-Wan is doing something genuinely wise, pointing Luke toward a philosophy of perspective rather than defending a specific deception. There's another version where he's rationalizing a choice that had real consequences. I think the most honest reading is that he's doing both at once, which is human, and that he genuinely believed the version of events he'd told Luke, in the sense that he'd processed Anakin's fall as a kind of death for years. Whether that excuses the specific wording of how he told it to a 20-year-old boy, who then charged headfirst toward a Sith Lord on incomplete information, is a separate question. What Obi-Wan gets right in that conversation is what he says about Anakin. He says that he couldn't see the good in him. He says that the Emperor was Vader's master and the controlling power, and he says there is still good in him, as though he believes it, even if he couldn't access it himself. He's telling Luke something true, and Luke is going to do with it what Obi-Wan couldn't. That's the handoff, in a sense. Obi-Wan had spent all those desert years protecting the container for something he couldn't himself complete. He told Vader goodbye. He accepted that Anakin was gone. And then he watched, from wherever Force ghosts watch from, as his best student's son walked into the middle of the problem and found what he couldn't find, which was the door back to Anakin that was always still there. The final scene of Return of the Jedi, Obi-Wan and Yoda and Anakin appearing as Force ghosts to watch Luke and the Ewok celebration, is one of those moments that hits differently, depending on how much of the surrounding story you've absorbed. On its own, it's a warm image, a nice ending. Surrounded by everything else, it's almost unbearably full of meaning. What the prequel trilogy and the animated series added to that image is everything that preceded it. The mission on Naboo, the year on Mandalore, all those years of training Anakin, the Clone Wars, Mustafar, the desert, all of it leading to this small celebration on a forest moon where a man who was born a slave and became the Emperor's most feared weapon is now standing in the Force, luminous and whole, beside his teacher. There are things the Star Wars franchise does imperfectly, and things it does extraordinarily well. And one of the things it does extraordinarily well is this: the weight of the past as something that doesn't disappear, but can be transformed. Anakin doesn't erase what Vader did by choosing to save his son. The harm was real, the people are still dead. But the person underneath it made a different choice at the end, and the Force, apparently, accounts for that in some way the living can't quite see. Obi-Wan standing there beside him is its own small completion. He'd been wrong about whether Anakin was gone, or he'd been right in some ways, and wrong in others. The man he'd trained and loved and failed and grieved, who'd spent decades as the instrument of something terrible, found his way back at the very end. Not in time to undo anything, but in time to stand in the light again. And Obi-Wan got to see it. Anakin is there. Not Vader Anakin as he looked when he was still whole before Mustafar. Young, which raises its own interesting questions about how Force spirits relate to age and time. And he's smiling, and the man beside him, who trained him and loved him and failed him and forgave him and watched over his children from a cave all those years, is smiling back. He made it. Whatever making it looks like for someone whose entire material existence is now a gentle shimmer in the Force, he made it. Let me step back from the chronology for a bit, because I've been thinking about what it is that makes Obi-Wan Kenobi work as a character across 5 decades of storytelling. It's not that he's uniquely powerful or uniquely wise. There are more powerful Jedi in the canon, Anakin obviously, Yoda. There are Jedi with more unusual abilities, more striking histories. What Obi-Wan has that's harder to find is consistency. He is, across every version and every era and every storytelling medium that has tackled him, recognisably the same person. The dry wit, the patient authority, the preference for understanding over conflict, the capacity for deep attachment, held very carefully within enormous emotional discipline. These things are consistent from the young man in The Phantom Menace to the worn-out hermit in A New Hope. The surface changes, the centre holds. That consistency under sustained loss is what I find most worth thinking about. Most characters, in most stories, have an arc that takes them somewhere different. They're transformed, or redeemed, or broken, and then rebuilt. Obi-Wan doesn't quite work that way. He doesn't transform exactly. The Disney Plus series shows him broken, genuinely broken in a way the films hadn't. But even there, the breaking doesn't change what he fundamentally is. It just reveals it. The steadiness was already there waiting, and all the experiences did was show how far down it went. The relationship with Anakin is the heart of it, really. That's the relationship the whole story orbits. Because Obi-Wan loved Anakin as clearly and as simply as any relationship in the saga, and Anakin fell, and Obi-Wan had to live with the question of whether it was partly his failure. He probably never fully answered that question. You could argue, as Anakin himself eventually argued, that the fall was Anakin's choice. You could also look at the specific ways in which the Jedi Order, and Obi-Wan, as part of it, didn't give Anakin what he needed, and feel the complexity of that. Obi-Wan wasn't a bad teacher. He also wasn't, in some ways, quite the right teacher for that particular student. Both things can be true. What's interesting is that Obi-Wan's response to that complexity was to keep going, not to resolve it neatly or to conclude either that he was blameless or that he'd fundamentally failed, just to accept it and continue, to take on the responsibility of watching over Luke and Leia, and to do that with as much care as he had, to keep trying to learn the things Qui-Gon had been teaching, to stay present in a situation that gave him every reason to disengage completely. There's a through line in his story that runs from the Mandalore year, when he chose the Order over Satine, to the cave on Tatooine, where he was essentially the Order's last active remnant on that planet. And it's the line of duty. Not duty as something cold or mechanical, but duty as love made disciplined. He cared about things, he cared about people, and he translated that caring into sustained patient service, even when there was nothing spectacular about it, even when it looked, from the outside, like an old man doing nothing very much in the desert. But talking about what ties all of it together, I keep coming back to the lightsaber. Anakin's lightsaber, the one Obi-Wan took from the bank of the lava river on Mustafar, wrapped in cloth and carried into exile. He kept it in the sand all those years. He gave it to Luke. Luke lost it in Cloud City. It made its way through decades and hands and history to Rey, who used it to fight the final battle against Palpatine, and when she buried it on Tatooine at the end of the Rise of Skywalker, she buried it where Obi-Wan had lived, where he'd kept it. The whole saga, in some sense, is in that object's journey. A weapon made by a slave boy who thought he was going to be a Jedi Knight, passed on in grief by the teacher who couldn't save him, used by the son who didn't know him, carried across a generation by people trying to understand what they'd inherited, and at the end of it, returned to the desert, given back to the sand. Obi-Wan Kenobi is a character about the weight of being responsible for something you didn't choose and can't set down. He was responsible for Anakin. He was responsible for Luke. He was responsible for whatever thread of hope remained in the galaxy after the Empire came. He didn't ask for any of it, and he carried it anyway, and the carrying was his life. I find that worth something. I find it worth a lot, actually. There's also something worth saying about Obi-Wan and the specific kind of wisdom he modelled, which was the wisdom of not knowing and continuing anyway. He didn't know when he took on Anakin whether he'd be a good teacher. He didn't know when he went into exile whether Luke would ever be what was needed. He didn't know when he let himself be killed on the Death Star whether it would matter. He acted on incomplete information with as much honesty and care as he could manage, and trusted that it was enough. That's actually quite a hard thing to do when you're someone who can think clearly and see consequences and understand what's at stake. Smart, careful people often don't act well under uncertainty because they can see too many ways things might go wrong. Obi-Wan's particular combination of intelligence and faith, where faith means something like trusting the Force's larger movement even when you can't see it, is what allowed him to keep going. He used his intelligence to do the job as well as possible in each moment. He used his faith to accept that the moment was all he had. That combination produced someone who was effective without being controlling, careful without being paralyzed. The galaxy he lived in punished him for being good in almost every way it could. It took his master, his love, his brother, his order, his purpose, his home. And he remained himself throughout all of it. Not unchanged, he was clearly changed, marked by everything that happened. But recognizably, continuously himself. That's the thing I keep coming back to in the end, the continuity of Obi-Wan Kenobi. And there's one last thing, one small detail from deep in the story, from the year he spent on Mandalore as a young Padawan, that I've been meaning to come back to. There's a version of Obi-Wan's life that diverged at that point, a version where he said yes when asked, where he and Satine went somewhere quieter, where he had a different life, presumably smaller and less catastrophic, but also genuinely his in a way the Jedi life wasn't quite. He chose otherwise, and the version of the story we have is what came from that choice, which is a lot of death and a lot of loss, and a lot of sand and exile, and also the destruction of the Empire, and the survival of the Jedi tradition, and the chance for something better. Whether that trade was worth it is a question I genuinely don't know how to answer. I don't think Obi-Wan knew either, but he made the choice honestly, and he held it honestly, and in the end he found his master again on the other side of the worst of it, and watched the people he'd protected and protected and protected finally be free. That feels like enough. Not uncomplicated, but enough. And that really is where I'll leave it for tonight. There's still a great deal more that could be said. The novel Master and Apprentice by Claudia Gray covers Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon on a mission just before the Phantom Menace, and does something genuinely beautiful with their dynamic in the last years of it. The Brotherhood novel goes deep into Obi-Wan's early days, training Anakin, and is worth your time if you enjoyed tonight's discussion. There are comics and short stories set throughout the exile period on Tatooine that add texture to those quiet years. The Ahsoka story continues long after Obi-Wan's death and is worth a whole video on its own. There's always more, but the shape of the thing, the full arc from Stugin to the luminous shimmer in the Force on Endor, that's what we covered tonight. A man who was nearly not chosen, who chose against his heart and for his duty, who trained the galaxy's greatest tragedy and loved him anyway, who sat in a desert for 19 years, holding a lightsaber in trust, who found his way back to himself just in time to pass on what he'd been given. I've been thinking about Obi-Wan Kenobi a lot lately. I think what keeps drawing me back is that he's a character about persistence, specifically the kind of persistence that isn't dramatic or triumphant or particularly photogenic. He persists, quietly, consistently, and in the face of circumstances that would have broken someone with less centre to them. He loses more than most people lose, and he keeps going, not because he's indestructible, but because he decided somewhere along the way that keeping going was what was required. There's something comforting in that, I think, even if the story itself is often very sad. Wherever you are right now, I hope you're comfortable. I hope tonight was a good one, or at least a tolerable one. And if you want to look something up in the morning, I do recommend The Clone Wars. Start from the beginning, go slowly, take your time with it. The best parts of Obi-Wan's story are in there, and they're well worth finding.